Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our dialogue on trafficking in human beings and the perspective and the possibilities of attaining results through partnerships, mainly through public-private partnerships. My name is George Papadimitrakopoulos, and I'm in dialogue with Mr. Rob Wainwright, the Executive Director of Europol. Let's get straight to it. Rob, why haven't we, as of now, solved the problem of human trafficking?
Well, that's because I think it's a problem, George, that is extremely challenging. It's a bit like asking why we haven't solved the problem of drugs or cybercrime. In fact, they're all, in the end, manifestations, criminal manifestations of our new globalized order. And in the field of trafficking in human beings, it benefits from the fact that there is, of course, greater opportunities for freedom of movement of people, and including victims, including across open borders, of course, in a large part of the European continent, about how technology has been abused by criminals, which also has given them significant opportunities and new opportunities to exploit victims, for example. So I see how a more globalized, how globalized conditions in the world are giving criminals a new lease of life, actually. And of course it's a very lucrative trade because there's a demand factor, particularly in parts of Europe, not only in the sex trade, but of course for cheap labor. And that drives up a trend that we're seeing at Europol, increasing amounts of illegal labor exploitation, especially. There's a push factor, unfortunately, because people are lured by false promises of jobs and a better lifestyle in the West, and of course they're duped into thinking they're getting a job in the hotelier trade, and then they're actually abused on arrival as well. And the people who are abusing these, who are propagating this trade, are becoming highly professional in their criminal pursuit. And it's a trend we see right across different criminal sectors. In the field of trafficking in human beings, international criminal syndicates that are at work now. This is not some petty criminal enterprise. These are people who are controlling the whole enterprise, from recruitment, transportation, exploitation in the destination country, and also the laundering of money as well. And they're very adept at using technology and other conditions to support their trade. What we see is increasing in scale at Europol. We've seen the amount of casework that we're doing now is 60% greater over the last 4 years. So there seems to be an increasing amount of that. I think part of that reflects a greater awakening amongst all our member states about this phenomena, which we haven't had until now, and that of course has been part of the problem. In the end, of course, despite this high-tech, highly professionalized business that I'm describing, these criminals in the end are trading in misery and violence, and we should never forget that. And it's one of the most pernicious forms of criminal activity that we see in Europe, and it's quite right, therefore, that it has become now a top priority in the European Union under our bid to arrest the increase in serious and organized crime.
Of course, the challenges are many and diverse, from trying to understand these people. Frequently, we hear in the news from prime ministers to experts calling them evil people. Evil obviously is a metaphysical term. These are the people next door. There are people who have normal businesses like car washes or nail salons, or as you mentioned before, other forms of legal business structures which are used to launder money and to actually hijack the real economy, and hence also transfer money through bank systems. And we have a difficulty also, if I understand correctly, in arresting these people, but also in curtailing trafficking, because we cannot find their money very easily, and the amount of seizure in assets is a challenge.
Yes, and I should explain, I've collaborated with George in his academic work in this area, and also his background in the finance industry. So you know something about this, of course, and together what we've been able to identify, yes, is again quite a sophisticated manipulation of the financial economy. The use, as you say, of legal business structures, cash-intensive structures like nail bars or car washes, that are used not only to put the victims of forced labor to work in, but also as a means of laundering the cash. I'm not sure I would characterize these people as the guys living next door, however. Certainly some of the victims, unfortunately, are from all walks of life. The criminals themselves tend to be professional criminals, career criminals, who might have progressed into trafficking human beings from maybe a drugs background because they see it as lower risk, higher profit, exactly.
Yes. That is indeed a challenge because you can sell perhaps drugs once or twice if you cut it, a weapon with good maintenance once or twice, but you can sell people 10, 15 times whilst in the meantime exploiting them whether in labor or in sex trafficking, forced begging and other forms.
Yes, and I'm afraid all of that is happening. This really is a miserable trade, I'm afraid, and people, very young victims, are forced on the streets, not just unfortunately to sell their bodies up to 20 times a day, that's the reality of this, but also into begging, pickpocketing on the streets of London or Paris, and this is a widespread operation. Some of the cases that we've worked at Europol involved a network of over 1,000 teenage boys and girls, Romanian victims generally, that were working on the streets of London and Madrid and many other European capitals every day, stealing credit cards, stealing phones. They themselves were the victims, of course. And it says a lot about how the police in most countries are not geared up to deal with this problem, because when a uniformed police officer on Oxford Street in London, this is actually what happened. When he arrests this 14-year-old boy, takes him down, the boy can't speak English, they don't know how to process him. They think, of course, that it's an isolated case until they get the next isolated case the next day, and so on and so on and so on. And in that case, it took some enterprising, intelligence-led work to understand what the criminal trend was here, and that's what allowed Europol finally to join the dots between different countries. So very often what we're seeing in front of us, including how some of these nail bars are operating, are very much part of an international criminal industry. And that sounds like I'm exaggerating it just for a Hollywood movie script, but I'm afraid it's not. It is the reality of how this crime works and how it manipulates, I'm afraid, so many thousands of victims across Europe every day.
And you have specialties, transporters, facilitators. Of course, corruption is the perennial enabler. If you don't have corruption in the borders or in other ways with, like the success you had now with the Greek police with the document forging in the form of corruption enables trafficking of people. And it's also important to realize how other crimes are interrelated and correlated with trafficking.
Yes, I think there's a whole criminal support industry that has grown up in itself very professional, that is producing very high quality fake documents, for example, that is providing a professional money laundering service. And they do that very often trading or offering their services for trade across darknet market forums. And they're offering it to whoever wants to pay the dollar, frankly. They might be sex traffickers, but they could be people smugglers or even terrorists as well. And it's become a concept that we understand at Europol as crime as a service, in the sense that it's a much more entrepreneurial, business-orientated environment where specialists, becoming more and more specialists in producing better and better services, are providing those services to a whole range of criminality. So that in itself interconnects different criminal areas, which is interesting. But in particular, I think we're seeing some connections between trafficking and, of course, people smuggling. And the concern that we've had at Europol over the last few years that with the migration crisis that we've had, with the sudden increase, of course, in the number of people that have arrived in Europe, they are themselves vulnerable, not just to being smuggled into Europe, but being exploited on arrival. Most of them don't start out the destination in that way. But once they arrive, they are in an ad hoc way, very often out of detention centers, reception centers, are recruited in that way. And there's a particular dimension to it which is most worrying, which is how many of the traffickers are targeting the youngest part of that migratory population. So unaccompanied minors, of which there have been tens of thousands that have arrived in Europe since 2015, unaccompanied, 16 or under, held in reception or detention centers, and then picked off, frankly, by certain traffickers. And that, of course, should worry us all. And it challenges the way in which our collective society and our government framework, from central government down to local authorities, how we can provide the right kind of response to a societal challenge, which is what that is.
Of course, just to clarify, survival, sex, and other forced criminalities aren't necessarily tantamount to trafficking, but there is this thing, and there is also the phenomenon of having persons re-victimized within the criminal justice system, which we have found also in the UK, for example. The famous case of the infamous case of the child from Vietnam in Scotland who was tending to a farm full of marijuana, and he was arrested, and he couldn't speak English, and people thought that he was the manager of this illicit enterprise, and luckily a social worker found him, and they were able to take him out of the criminal justice system and realize he was already a victim because he was only 14 years old. So indeed, it says a lot about our society and how we view things and blame sometimes the victims indeed.
Yes, and we still don't have the same, as I said in my introductory comments, we don't have a common understanding of how important this problem is across Europe. I think in the United Kingdom, maybe I'm biased because of my nationality, but I'm the director of Europol, so I serve all 28 member states equally, of course. But I see in the United Kingdom, and the Prime Minister especially is taking this as a personal priority in her position, and she has, I think, pushed an agenda which is commendable in many respects. Some of that I see in some other countries, mostly not. And so the appetite just isn't there just yet to see this for what it is. So part of the agenda of Europol, I think, is in running more successful operations, collecting more intelligence so that we can take a better, more informed view towards the political class, the ministers that we report to, in order that they are better informed, perhaps, or as to the gravity of this problem.
Indeed, that's what I want to talk about next, was the fact that we see criminals work seamlessly over and above ethnic and religious backgrounds, whereas we have issues on which day to celebrate Trafficking Day or how to define it as modern day slavery, as trafficking in persons. And these guys work in the most unbelievable cases seamlessly and sell people like chattel left and right. And what's amazing with Europol, and it's indeed something which is commendable, is how you've managed to agglomerate all this information. I think it's over 1,000 different entities, and be this knowledge management center, and also able to disseminate and coordinate globally, not just within Europe, but globally. People don't realize this, and share information and try to be one step ahead of these organized criminals.
Yeah, we've tried to exploit the unique characteristics that Europol has of operating across Europe and indeed with many other countries, and our legal and operational capability to collect so much data. And what we found, of course, is when we see the emergence of this fundamentally more transnational form of crime, such as trafficking human beings, we recognize that the old adage, a bit of a cliche, to defeat a network, you build your own network. And so you've got to design a stronger transnational network yourself, of course. But the key to it is having better insight and understanding of how that trade is working. And that means better intelligence. That means better data collection. And when you combine those two things, where Europol has unique potential, then you design a network especially for collecting more data. Then you apply modern data science, data analytics to that capability, and you use the integrated nature of your framework to coordinate an operational response. So that's been our deliberate strategy. What we wrote 8 or 9 years ago, Europol shall become the information hub of the EU's response to crime and terrorism. So we set out to establish a unique, the only secure police network in Europe. Today, as George says, 1,200 different law enforcement agencies and special units are sharing data on that network every day. That's an enormous amount of data. We're consuming 11 terabytes of data every week at our headquarters. And we're applying, as I said, very modern data analytics techniques to that. And what we're identifying with the more and more data that we collect are more and more identifying these cross-border activities of crime, because that's the very nature of what it is these days. So it's a capability that precisely addresses the nature of crime today. And from that, you identify opportunities for police engagement. And that's why we've been able to run over 1,000 cases in this area alone over the last year.
Yes, that's very impressive. And as an old professor of mine used to say, everybody's entitled to their own opinions, not their own facts. So facts are an interesting thing, and we have to keep an open mind, because we always assume countries are usually divided in source, transit, entrepot, and destination countries. And we always assume that Nigerian people, for example, are trafficked from Ebo State to the UK, given the ties. And then we found out through what you just mentioned, sharing of information in traditional human intelligence, that many a times actually the UK is the transit and they end up being trafficked from Nigeria through the UK to other parts of Europe, which nobody would have thought or actually propounded without the evidence. So it's important to listen to the evidence and the facts and not have these idées fixes about who is what and which country is a destination, which country is a transit country.
Yeah, and I think what we found is that we also had to fight the sort of conventional police instinct, which is to get information and to act on it immediately by interpreting it in its basic form. What I mean by that is, if you're investigating a criminal organization, you identify someone who seems to be involved, you throw all the resources at trying to arrest him, instead of having a strategy that's a bit more sophisticated, long-term and strategic. And so of all the data that we're collecting, our primary goal is to run more and more operations, but also we're sitting on this wealth of strategic information, this insight. And that allows us to spot trends and characteristics that are not clear to everyone, and certainly not clear to our ministers. So that's an example, George, that you've also been working on in your research work, of how the trade changes quite quickly. And we need to be ahead of that, of course.
Of course. In my case with Greece, I always presumed that Greece was mainly a destination and a transit country, but perhaps with the crisis it could become also a source country, because people don't realize that trafficking can also be internal, versus with people smuggling, transnationality is a sine qua non, versus in trafficking you can have trafficking from Bern to Geneva without having to cross any borders.
One of the most interesting phenomena that we've recognized over the last 12 to 18 months, well, the current figure is that 68% of all traffic victims in the European Union are EU nationals. They're not from Asia, they're not from Africa. 2/3 of them are from the European Union. And even within that, you would expect, well, that's mostly Bulgarians, Romanians, Lithuanians being trafficked to the West. Yes, but actually increasingly not only that as well. And there's a very complex picture, as you said, George, of how victims are trafficked from west to east as well as the other way around, from north to south and so on. So there is a different kind of more complex criminal problem that's emerging, which requires us to be alert to those changes, of course. It requires good police work, but also engagement with other partners, not least in the academic world, who are monitoring these trends and therefore can give us smarter answers, smarter strategies for the future.
Yes.
Could we just ask, could we ask you not to make such a noise at the back, please? Thank you. Hope you don't mind me jumping in there, George. It's the sort of policeman in me a little bit. Sit down.
I was actually about to do that, but thank you. Great. So yes, basically, you raised some very important points. Could we, because everybody always talks about the good, the kumbaya factor of, participation and partnerships. And yes, partnerships are necessary, networks are necessary. Could you please forthrightly offer us some insights into the challenges of trust, of information sharing, of comparable and up-to-date data, and so we can give also more realistic, more pragmatic insight to our guests. And
yeah, well, it's more than kumbaya. Europol would have no success without its partnerships. I told you, everything that we do depends on our ability to interconnect this large network of agencies. Everything that we do depends on that. And of course, as we've learned from that, we've extended this model of partnership beyond the classical law enforcement or even government community, working with academia, working with the banking industry. Some actually quite successful initiatives, a so-called European Bankers Alliance Against Human Trafficking, which has allowed us to use the anti-money laundering regime, which is very robust in its nature, to also to model and identify indicators that might flag to even a bank clerk in a local branch something suspicious about where that money is coming from, and it might be connected to sex trafficking, for example. And that's worked. It's led to many more referrals from the banking industry, which the police have referred to. So I think this model of partnership is much more advanced than it was even 3 years ago, and has proven its worth.
Indeed. But in results-wise, I think you mentioned that the amount of assets seized from criminals is, what's the number? Remind me.
Well, that's a different matter,
yes.
and that's another session in itself. Unfortunately, the whole regime, although it has a lot of potential because of its robust regulatory effect, it's not being used very, very well. And in fact, of all the criminal assets, the figure you're searching for, of all the criminal assets that are produced each year in Europe, we are seizing only 1% of them through this regime of banking, regulatory oversight, and law enforcement attention. So what it means, I'm afraid, is that the banking industry is being exploited every day by criminal enterprises, and we're not doing a good enough job to seize those assets.
Having said that, to reverse exactly the same point, I remember in one of our discussions you mentioned the unrealistic cynicism, though, from some law enforcement, where they say, because there's so much room for improvement, should we do nothing? Obviously not. I think that's a point worth mentioning, that despite the room for improvement, the cynical perception of some law enforcement agencies who say that there is room for improvement isn't enough. We should still continue and hammer on and try to use technology like blockchain you mentioned and other technologies to try to understand and know your customer in a digital world, and hammer on and continue to try to seize these assets and hurt them, because it's a high profit crime, and that's where it really hurts them. So I think it's important to mention the fact that there's room for improvement, but nevertheless, we should still hammer on continuing this in this vein.
I think there's a tendency towards inertia in any large bureaucracy and administration, law enforcement, government, private sector as well. And you've got to fight that and challenge that. You have to use a business term, of course, you've got to have an appetite for disruption and continuous improvement, and to recognize that you can always do more, you should always be trying to do more. But let's start from the baseline of telling ourselves all the time, we have to follow the money, we have to do more. That's where it really hurts the criminals. By following the money, we're 1% successful. Who on earth is going to should be satisfied with that? So that gives people in the community, including me, some energy, some motivation that we have to grip this and do something a lot more with it, and that's part of the top priorities that Europol is running at the moment.
Yeah, people, we were discussing this earlier, people get into these monomaniacal trends, follow the money, or supply chains, and these are great ideas, they're great, but you have to do them, they're not mutually exclusive, obviously, and not, of course, collectively exhaustive. So there's many...
Tell me about what you found, particularly on supply chains. I'm interested in that.
Right, yeah. With my business background, if I may, thank you for asking me. I was actually a bit perturbed and surprised how it's basically a misnomer. It's not a linear supply chain like the 19th century. You can tell your procurer to stop hiring slaves or traffic people. It's, I think Unilever has operations in 180 countries as of today, and it's a dynamic, opaque network. There's no certification. Governments are having a tough time trying to police this, and they've delegated, with a name and shame strategy, they've delegated responsibility to these companies who they lack the legitimacy, they don't have the know-how, the legal structures, the authority, the gravitas to actually police their supply chains, and there's no authenticating authority, there's no certification. So it's very hard. Even if you have a certification, so-and-so is trafficking free. The next day, seasonal workers, they might hire a slave. If the mentality doesn't change, if the training doesn't change, it's nigh impossible to expect some certification, which is self-imposed, to solve this problem. Also, if I may mention one more pet peeve, is this monomaniacal focus on numbers. What is the number of slaves or trafficked people every day? Some numbers are unknowable. If I asked anybody in the audience, what is the number of birds in flight as of now, right now, could you answer me? No. If I gave you unlimited resource, if I gave you thousands of people, could you tell me this number? No. Nevertheless, it's still an integer. It's not some sort of crazy number. How many birds are in flight right now? We don't know. So yes, we have over 20 million slaves. That's enough for us to do work sedulously and assiduously for the next 20 years. And then some. So knowing if it's 45 or 40 or changing the directions. I remember in Greece they told us we have 45,000 trafficking victims, 3 times the amount of the UK. I mean, some of these numbers don't even pass the simple pinch test. We have to be a bit more pragmatic and a bit more weary of trends and fads and focusing only on one thing. Fads like numbers or supply chains only or follow the money only. It's a much more complicated problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think what is important, though, is that we have to find attempt to find a reliable means by which to quantify a threat type. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us to make informed decisions about which priorities we should follow. So it is important. It doesn't mean we need to have, I agree with you, a precise number, or chase the idea of a precise number when it's so difficult to get. And there's a danger associated with that. In respect of cybercrime, for example, which is the flavor of the day, it's a multi-billion-dollar internet security, $150 billion actually. That's the size of the internet security enterprise these days, that industry. So there are a lot of people out there offering fool's gold with the latest cybersecurity capabilities. And to support their business case, they're frankly inventing numbers about the size of cybercrime losses in industry, and it can range from 100 billion to trillions.
Yeah, I heard 4 trillion the other day.
4 trillion now, so there's a natural inflation. So I'm always very wary of that, about the way in which people immediately reach to numbers and statistics to justify their cause. But I still, nonetheless, we need to have some accurate descriptor and understanding of the relative importance of certain criminal threats.
And I think we can all these problems and challenges we mentioned, I think the idea of true partnerships with trust, which is forged and fostered through time, through challenges, through cultural differences and wars, is very important, because nobody by themselves, just academia, just law enforcement, just intelligence, just private companies can resolve this. I think we need not just to pay lip service, but actually have practical steps and actually take risks. I've been in plethora of meetings where people don't share numbers, and these are vetted people who are fervent about solving trafficking, and they never share numbers, because if they share numbers, they lose the monopoly to the intelligence and hence their funding. It's not about your funding. It's about solving this problem and stopping the crime-generated suffering of human beings. This is what's at the base of it, I think.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent it quite rightly should be a moral-led agenda in that sense, and a recognition that this is not just another cost on business, for example, and it's certainly not just another problem in society. This is a trade in misery. These many young people are really being forced to lead a miserable, terrible existence. And a lot of people are dying, of course, as well. So, I mean, it's something, although not everyone likes the use of the terminology, when Theresa May talks about it as modern slavery, she's kind of right. It's a recognition. We have to face up to the fact that, to a significant extent, we have a problem of modern slavery in our modern society, and none of us should stand for that. And in taking a stand against it, I think it is a collective responsibility across society, across business and governments as well.
Yes. But we have to speak truth to power and be sincere and forthright, because we don't want to have moral panics or some sort of blasé feeling, because we say, oh, we have to have awareness. After a while, everybody's aware, and you get this numbness. Okay, we're aware, nothing's changing, everything is just dreary and depressing, and people at some point, I think, just shut off. So we need to show also small wins and focus on strategic, longer term successes and collaborations, and especially with the public-private type of partnership, I think being key.
Yeah, I think there are more and more small wins. I mentioned earlier around 1,000 cases that Europol successfully ran last year, including 3 large-scale enterprises. So one of the approaches we took last year, 3 separate weeks between May and October, to focus on different dimensions of this. First, the labor exploitation trade, then the sex trade, and finally a specific targeted week of action to focus on the problem of child migrants and the exploitation of them. This involved thousands of officers in 26 countries for a week long each time, raiding hundreds, if not thousands, of establishments, for example, and leading to the arrests of hundreds of criminals. I'm using numbers now to support my case, but I'm very clear, I'm very certain of these numbers at least. So there are a lot of successes, and you're right, that has to feed the momentum in making sure that this is one of the things we're really working against.
Super. I think we're just out of time. Rob, thank you so much for your time and insights. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure, George. Thank you. Well done.